So let's conclude this section by reminding ourselves again that there is a scale issue always involved, and obviously if things are too small scale, maybe you don't accomplish the goal of reducing global warming. But if the scale gets beyond a certain threshold, then the unintended consequences, local and remote, are maybe unpredictable and uncontrollable. So we talked about the hemispheric scale experiments like the volcanic cooling, etc., which can end up creating changes in large-scale rainfall that are related to the movement of the ITCZ, as we said. So in general, you will hear lots of opposition to geoengineering as a whole, always referred to as Frankenstein experiment and just reckless and so on. And yet people generally accept small-scale geoengineering experiments without knowing that they are geoengineering. For example, here is a nice little town, you can guess where it is, which is resorted to buildings being painted bright white colors, and there's a nice swimming pool down there, which is very tempting. And obviously this is a collective understanding that if we use bright white paint, you are going to reflect sunlight and cool the buildings. The insides are going to be much more comfortable and so on. And at what scale do we start to say, wait a minute, what are we doing on a whole, right? Now there is even a new paint invented, which is supposedly the whitest paint you can buy. The usual white paints with good quality properties reflect up to 85%, but the super white paint Teflon apparently can reflect 98% of the sunlight. You can imagine how much cooling that's going to offer. But how do we think about the scale at which we would do that? The other ideas that are typically accepted and used widely without worrying about geoengineering is, of course, the rooftop gardens, which cool the buildings quite a bit as well, and beautiful designs incorporating the gardens are built. You can see here, rooftop here looks pretty beautiful, right? Obviously has quite an impact on reducing the heating of the building, not by albedo here, of course, by evapotranspiration and other ways, but even vertical farming in urban centers is now considered a way to reduce carbon dioxide and increase food production and so on and so forth. All these are considered generally small scale, and they are not considered geoengineering in the general term because of that scale. But we never think about what would happen if everybody started doing it. It would amount essentially to a large-scale geoengineering project, which we have discussed here more formally as planetary scale geoengineering experiments, right? So what am I saying? Basically that we are somehow spooked by certain things, even though in a different context we are not so spooked by them or even think of them as very good ideas. Okay? To summarize this whole solar radiation management, this is again from Carbon Brief. We looked at another version of this before. So here, theoretical measures to slow global warming by reflecting more sunlight away from the Earth is called solar radiation management in general. And of course there are drawbacks, danger of sudden warming if system fails. We talked about termination shock, and danger of changing rainfall patterns, which we know from Pinatubo and other volcanic experiments that when you have large-scale cooling, either through volcanic eruptions or geoengineering approaches, you do change circulations and the whole atmospheric dynamics and thermodynamics, which ends up not only changing rainfall patterns but actually making more vulnerable places you suffer even more. That's not something you want to do, right? Like if Sahara gets less rain, Sahel gets less rain, that's not going to be a good thing. Okay, so the ideas we talked about, not in so detail, but the giant mirrors in space to reflect 1 to 2% of the rays, injecting tiny reflective particles into the stratosphere, which we talked in some details in terms of whether to do sulfur dioxide or sulfuric acid directly to skip few steps, what would happen to the stratospheric heating and impact on cirrus, what would happen to the ozone hole, what would happen to the corals, the rainfall patterns, and so on. Marine cloud whitening by using ships to spray salt water into the air. Again, seems like a local scale experiment that can be done, but choosing the place to have an impact and to really make sure that the clouds don't have, brighter clouds don't have wider scale impacts is not completed yet. Obviously, anything you do to affect radiation balance of the atmosphere is going to have global impacts beyond a certain scale. This is guaranteed. So that's always a concern. Brightening the ocean surface by using ships to generate sea foam or adding certain chemicals to the wake to make the natural microbubbles produced by the trail to last longer. In the lab, experiments have been done, and model experiments have been done, as we just saw. Even a small change in ocean albedo can produce substantial cooling, but the patterns are again some things that can have negative impacts on rainfall in certain regions. Lightening color of crop leaves, we mentioned, genetic modification of the waxing properties and so on. Very good idea. And we looked at the available crop fractional crop cover area over the globe, which is substantial, but we saw that the increasing albedo by modifying crop leaves can produce warming over India, warming over the Arctic or Greenland. So there are all those unintended consequences. And there was changes in soil moisture as well, because you changed the air temperature and land temperature difference, as well as changing rainfall patterns. And soil moisture is a very critical ingredient for agriculture, and of course also for heat waves and so on, right? Evaporative cooling is a significant fraction of damping heat waves. Whitening the roofs, as we said just now, is generally accepted as a good idea even at town levels, but people don't think of it so much as geoengineering and don't necessarily think about how many towns can do this and not have a negative or unintended consequence elsewhere or locally, right? What would happen locally to the rainfall pattern if you had a whole region instead of one little town doing this whitening of solar roofs or rooftop gardens and so on? Especially rooftop gardens affect evapotranspiration and local microclimate and moisture budgets and so on and so forth. So the whole debate of making these choices is quite complicated. So we will look at the governance issues and the opportunities that arise out of all these ideas that we have talked about in these few sections we have come through in terms of energies and substances. Okay.